So good morning, good afternoon and good evening to all our participants and our audience. It's now 9 o'clock in the UK. I'm Caroline Kennedy-Pipe from the University of Loughborough, and I'm chairing this session at Chatham House with a hugely distinguished panel. We're very lucky to be here this morning talking about the Arctic, and in particular UK and Japanese responses to what is unfolding in the region of the Arctic. The panel needs very little introduction. You have the biographies, but I would like to welcome them all from wherever they may be in the world, and in particular welcome Her Excellency Kazuo Shirase, Dr. Aki Tamaki, and Dr. Nanj Liu. All have studied the Arctic. Her Excellency, of course, led Japanese policy towards the Arctic, and so we're really looking forward to hearing them. We're going to start with Her Excellency and her wealth of experience representing Japanese interests in the Arctic. So, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I am pleased to be with you, and I am very much honored to make some remarks at prestigious Chatham House. On speaking about engaging the Arctic, UK and Japan responses, I tried to find similarities or common values of two countries with respect to the Arctic. Both countries are non-Arctic states. First page, please. Yes, both countries are non-Arctic states and observers of Arctic Council. Whenever I had a chance to speak about Japan's Arctic policy, I spoke that Japan is neighbor of Arctic states because a crew of the ship sailing the Arctic Ocean to the east via Northern Sea route goes through Bering Strait between US and Russia, finds Japan as a first country other than Arctic states. Just to be sure, I am saying Japan is neighbor of Arctic states. Japan has never claimed itself the near Arctic state. And the UK has a similar geographical position with respect to the Arctic Ocean, but to the west dimension. The two countries are ally of US, which is, of course, the one of the important member of Arctic Council and plays always leading role in addressing the Arctic issues. Both researchers, I mean that the UK and Japan have rich and long experience of Arctic research. And also we share the fundamental values, including rule-based international order. Taking account in these similarities, I would like to touch upon later potential of the cooperation between UK and Japan in the Arctic. Now, I want to explain about Japan's Arctic policy, features adopted by the government of Japan for the first time in history in October 2015. Why the government of Japan determined to adopt it? Of course, the climate in Arctic change, climate change in the Arctic directly affects the climate in Japan. But that is not the best reason. Japan's Arctic policy aims to set Japan as an important player that contributes to international community through its action to Arctic issues. The challenges in the Arctic are common concerns shared by international community, regardless whether or not they are Arctic states. We need to tackle these challenges together. On the other hand, global warming and its effects has created opportunities of natural resources development and the use of northern sea route. Then how Japanese can contribute to the international community? We believe that minimizing the negative effects and maximizing the opportunities of the Arctic can benefit us all. For achieving this goal, we should understand how the Arctic environment has been changing and what impacts these changes have on human communities and economies. Therefore, it is particularly important to reveal the mechanism of the Arctic environment change which are yet unclear. So Japan's Arctic policy put the emphasis on the following three specific initiatives. First, international cooperation in Arctic scientific research. 2, rule of law. 3, sustainable use. First, on international cooperation in Arctic scientific research, understanding the climate change mechanisms in the Arctic based on solid scientific data allows us to make appropriate responses and to pursue sustainable development in the area. Japan has been contributing to research and scientific observations in the Arctic since the 1950s and promoting scientific cooperation in the Arctic with the relevant countries. By making use of this scientific research, Japan continues to play a role in this area. One good example of our efforts, it is Arctic research project called ARCS, or Arctic Challenge for Sustainability, which was initiated in 2015 as our national flagship project. The participating institutions have promoted research in such areas as climate, weather, ocean environment, biodiversity, and community. ARCS contributes to clarifying the climate changes and environment effects in the Arctic and to improving project environmental assessment and the life of community in the Arctic. Another example is the Arctic Data Archive System, which has been operating since 2012. This system allows all of us to get an access to multiple and also that model simulation datasets, which are collected by Japanese scientists. This data is open to all on the website and contributes to enhancing scientific research in the Arctic. I always proudly announce Japan's attitude of data openness. We hope that other countries will also become open for further international cooperation in Arctic scientific research. Japan will organize the next Arctic Scientific Ministerial meeting in Tokyo in May 2021 with co-organizing partner Iceland, the chair of Arctic Council. The meeting will be a good opportunity to discuss international scientific cooperation. It highlights the importance of promoting the Arctic-related data sharing. How should we act when we see the expanding opportunity in the Arctic? That is the second emphasis on the role of law in the Arctic. No one wants to the Arctic be a place where interests collide and conflicts are solved by power. Free and open maritime order based on the rule of law is indispensable. The international community needs to respect a rule-based maritime order built on international law in the Arctic as well. In 2017, I chaired a second trilateral high-level dialogue on the Arctic in Tokyo. The members of this dialogue are Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea. I think the significance of this dialogue was that the importance of the rule-based maritime order was affirmed then by these three countries. I want to give you one more example of active participation in the formulation process of new international rules for the Arctic. It is the agreement Prevent Unregulated High Seas Fisheries signed on October 3rd, 2018, IRUSAT. I recall it was 2015 when the US representative sounded at me and the representatives of China and the Republic of Korea about our interest in participating in the negotiations on this agreement. Japan and Korea reacted immediately and conveyed their readiness. Although China showed a reluctant attitude at first, because according to his opinion, there is no necessity. Later, China changed its attitude, and all these three countries, with European Union and Iceland, began to join the 5 Arctic Ocean coastal states, so-called A5, in negotiations in December 2015. The agreement has not entered yet because China has not ratified. Taking account into the current lack of commercial fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, combined with a low likelihood of commercial fisheries taking place there, even in the long run, the entry in force of the agreement may not be an emergency task. But I perceive the adoption of the agreement itself as a very important step in forming the rule by the Arctic states with non-Arctic states. The entry into force is very much expected. I am interested in now whether after Brexit, UK will succeed to this agreement. Third, on the pursuit of sustainable economic use. The issues has two aspects, namely opportunities and challenges. The opportunities are expanding. Geographically, as I told before, the Japan, especially the Hokkaido, the northmost island of Japan, is a gateway from the Asia to Northern Sea route. As far as I know, the volume of cargoes of ships sailing via Northern Sea route is increasing, especially after the commencement of production LNG at Yamal. Last July, Icebreaker LNG, carrier owned by Japan-China joint company and operated by Japanese company, which sailed via the Northern Sea route, called at Port of Tokyo for the first time in history. So far, we see the potential opportunity for this route. Also, I'd like to mention about the development cooperation with Russia. While Japan is promoting comprehensive energy development, cooperation with Russia in its Arctic regions, while fully taking account of the environment. In September last year, Mitsui and Company Limited and Japan Oil, Gas and Metal National Cooperation, or JOGMEC, made an investment decision on Arctic LNG 2 project, in which Mitsui and JOGMEC hold 10% stake. Finally, on conclusion, Japan will further promote cooperate with Arctic states and other stakeholders. I think that cooperation in the Arctic scientific research between Japan and the UK are low despite the size of potential. Last year, German icebreaker research vessel provided the researcher from 20 countries, including Japan, to international Arctic research opportunities. Since we have not possessed yet icebreaker research vessel, it was a good opportunity for our researchers. UK and Japan are marine states and have big opportunity using Arctic sea routes. Our two countries have a possibility to be involved widely in energy development in the Arctic. We need further cooperation for ensuring free and open maritime order based on rule of law. It is a fact that neither suitable use or economic use nor secure free sailing will be effective without cooperation with Arctic coastal states. During my duty of Arctic ambassador from 2015 to 2017, US Obama administration was the chair of the Arctic Council and promoted international initiative. The US hosted the conference Global Leadership in the Arctic Cooperation, Innovation, Engagement, and Resilience, or GLACIER, in August 2015. President Obama himself was present, and that conference brought together foreign ministers of Arctic states and key non-Arctic states, including Japan. I was the representative of the Japanese government there. US took a leadership in commencing the agreement, negotiations on the agreement unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean in December 2015. The White House hosted the first Arctic scientific ministerial meeting in September 2016, invited 8 Arctic states and 14 non-Arctic states and EU. I hope US to take international initiative in dealing with the Arctic issues with cooperation with non-Arctic states, of course, including UK and Japan. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Shuravsky, thank you for a fascinating talk and so many ideas there to take away, not least returning to our theme of the Arctic as both space and gateway, the prospects for cooperation, and the thorny issue of really the riches that the Northern Sea Route might offer and the timescale in which it might open up to commercial ventures. So thank you, and I'm sure that we will already have many Q&As, actually. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Aki, if that's okay, for 10 minutes, Aki, on
Yes.
your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Aki Tonami, and I'm an associate professor of international relations and economics at the University of Tsukuba, Japan. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk and discuss the UK-Japan cooperation on the Arctic with other experts today. So if we look at Japan's situational awareness as regards the Arctic, we can see there are 2 key types. One is the regional security in a more traditional sense, and a broader sense of security. I'll offer those 2 conceptual references, first to explain Japan's ambition in the region, followed by what opportunities for strengthening and developing the Arctic rules-based order there are. So the 2 key types of Japan's situational awareness as regards the Arctic. First is the regional security in a more traditional sense. I would like the audience to take note that the strategic environment Japan is in. It is the 3rd largest economy in the world, neighbor to China and Russia, which are 2 of the world's most powerful nations, and an ally of the United States. And the relationship amongst Japan's 2 neighboring countries in East Asia, China and South Korea can be understood as that of frenemies. Japan was an imperial power for almost a century until the end of the Second World War. So it's been complicated in terms of history, politics, economy, and security, and they compete and cooperate at the same time with each other. However, one of the many things that they do have in common is a strong belief in developmentalism, which is an approach to national economic development that emphasizes the intervention of the state. So for those three countries, central government matters and economic growth matters. Economic security can be sometimes more important than military security, which is provided by the US nuclear security umbrella. So it's extremely important to understand Japan sees the rest of the world, first of all, through this filter. Second, a broader sense of security. Another idea China, Japan, and South Korea share, particularly in terms of the Arctic, is a broader sense of security, which are about energy security, climate change, and sometimes food. So why energy security? That's because China, Japan, and South Korea are highly dependent on imported energy resources. China more than 70%, Japan almost 90%, South Korea 80%. And because the Asia-Pacific region is so fragmented geographically and oil resources are distributed so unevenly, transporting oil by pipeline is extremely limited. Hence, the ability to diversify supply sources and transport routes is vitally important for China, Japan, and South Korea. In this context, Russia, which has become much closer to China in recent years, wants to avoid a situation where it is completely dependent on China, and it reached out to Tokyo as well as to Seoul. As Ambassador Shiraishi mentioned, Mitsui, which is one of Japan's largest general trading companies, took 10% stake in Novatech's Arctic LNG project, which was supported by JOGMEC, a semi-governmental organization. And the second component of the comprehensive security is the climate change, which is mostly dealt by the scientific community, as explained by Ambassador Shiraishi. Last, about food security, it's mostly about marine resources. Japan is one of the largest importers of fish resources from the Arctic region. So its commitment to food security has resulted in the agreement to prevent unregulated high seas fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, which is also signed by China and South Korea. So competition and cooperation among China, Japan, and South Korea about components of the broader sense of security as well. With these elements in mind, what are the opportunities for strengthening and developing the Arctic rules-based order? But before I go on, I would like to remind the audience that there's something to keep in mind, which is that in order to cope with and adapt to the quickly transforming Arctic, there has been calls for the creation of a new regime for the Arctic, like a legally binding Arctic Treaty. In 2008, however, in the Ilulissat Declaration, the Arctic coastal states formally rejected any need to develop a new comprehensive international legal regime to govern the Arctic Ocean, similar to the Antarctic Treaty System. So this was also an acknowledgement, that the existing legal framework created around 1982 United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS, is sufficient, and the Arctic legal order should remain more flexible than rigid, based on soft law instruments and non-binding cooperative frameworks. So in addition, the Arctic Council is neither an international organization or does it have formal lawmaking capacities. Hence, this unique setup of Arctic governance very much limits the participation of the United Kingdom and Japan or other actors in the decision-making process, since they are, legally speaking, outsiders. Yet it allows us, or allows the UK and Japan to play a different but not insignificant role in developing norms in or about the Arctic. For example, via an Arctic state or permanent participant, they are able to propose projects which reinforce their views on specific issues. So in this regard, the roles that Japan has played so far and its influence in the past in the Arctic legal order making has been limited, mainly because the Arctic Council has been the principal institution, and as observers, the participation of Japan has been clearly delineated by the Observer Manual. Lastly, there's also a fundamental difference between the ways that existing Arctic states and Asian states such as China, Japan, and South Korea see the Arctic. Arctic states take a more liberal institutional approach, while Asian actors incline to be realists. Arctic states expect Asian states' greater role in international normative and institutional framework, particularly within already existing institutions such as the Arctic Council. However, from the Asian states' point of view, they're only willing to play a role to the extent that the rule and norm-making efforts serve their political or economic goals, and where they can clearly see the value of making mutually acceptable norms and codes of conduct in pursuing their regional or comprehensive security. Shiping Tan and John Eikenberry called this phenomenon that non-Western countries, including rising powers like China, having more input into writing the rules of the future order as contested multilateralism. Therefore, in strengthening and developing the Arctic's rules-based order, it is crucial that we pay attention not only to changes in the natural and strategic environment in the Arctic itself, but also to the environments surrounding the Arctic, even if they can seem geographically distant.
Thank you, Aki. And again, raising all sorts of issues about perceptions of the Arctic by Arctic states and those who are near Arctic states or would wish to position themselves in such a manner. And of course, you've raised here the state that preoccupies much debate. It's already being raised in the chat, China, and China's intentions in the Arctic. So thank you, Aki. And I think we will move back to this idea, and we do have a poll in the field about conflict and cooperation, about competing visions of norms and international governance going forward. And I should also add there, as the ambassador pointed out, that we're not just talking about states' rights and perceptions of states' rights, but also commercial rights, again, as you highlight in terms of fishing, but also oil and gas. So thank you. I'm now going to turn to our colleague in Australia. I believe it's late there at night, Dr. Liu, and hand over to you for 10 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Caroline, and thank you for having me in this fascinating panel organized by Chatham House. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional people traditional owner of the land of where Macquarie University is situated, the Daru people, and also pay my respect to the elders present and past and present. My brief talk will consist of 3 parts today. First, I will talk about some observations of the UK's Arctic policy, and then my focus will be a critique on the term of the rules-based international order. And finally, I will share some thoughts on to what extent could UK and Japan enhance the existing or the rules-based international order in the Arctic. First, I must say, during my time in Scotland, and then when I heard the news that the European Polar Board, which used to be headquartered in Cambridge, moved to the Netherlands because of the Brexit, I really feel it's quite a pity, because UK, no doubt, is a very influential Arctic player, given its history, its experience, its geographical proximity, and also economic and military power in the Arctic. So anyway, so I think before 2018, when the UK government published its Arctic policy, the European Union has already published 3 Arctic policies in 2008, 12, and 16. So there is also a consultation going on at the moment that there is another EU Arctic policy to be published next year. So I think it's a pity because UK now is not part of the EU, but which would make the EU's Arctic policy much more influential. But still, I think because the UK and the EU share a lot of values and visions of the Arctic, so the coordination could still happen, hopefully, to a certain extent. And when it comes to UK, and I noticed that in the 2018 Arctic policy, which is the second Arctic policy paper published by the UK government, following the first one in 2013, the UK government opposed this idea or its vision of the global Britain, which is a very interesting idea, and it does mention a kind of a vision of global Britain that will be materialized in the Arctic to advance the Arctic prosperity and security. But we shouldn't forget and also this is also mentioned in the UK's Arctic policy, that there is a third dimension of when we are talking about UK's Arctic policy, that is Scottish Arctic policy. The Scotland published its own Arctic policy, which is called Arctic Connections in 2019. And if you read that paper, I think it's very clear. It's actually a kind of a response to the Brexit, that pretty much trying to emphasize that Scotland wants to keep its status or enhance its status as a European gateway to the Arctic. So I think that's the kind of the three dimensions of UK's Arctic policy that we need to bear in mind. And now let's come to the elephant in the room. How could the UK and Japan enhance its cooperation to defend the rules-based international order, in particular in the Arctic? I mean, this is a very popular kind of narrative. I believe even this term, the rules-based international order, was, if I'm not mistaken, was actually sort of invented by Chatham House in 2015 in its report, The Challenges to Rules-Based International Order. And this becomes so popular, and governments, especially defense departments in Australia, in UK, in US, they like this so much. For example, in the Australian Defense White Paper published in 2016, someone, not me, counted that this term has been used 48 times. So, but I mean, my critique of this term, there are 4 brief points. First, I think this term is a neutral term when we are talking about the rules-based international order. It actually depends who is talking about this term. So there is already a power structure behind this. And also, I think different people talk about rules-based order from different perspectives. International lawyers tend to focus on rules, and political scientists tend to focus on order. But sometimes they can be confused or conflicted with each other, because sometimes when we are talking about the challenges, we are talking about countries who are depicted as potential rule breaker. But when actually this is not happening, it is actually about a changing order because of the rising power in this power structure. And then if we even take a deeper look into the rules, rules-based international order, so then the question can be, for example, what about the rules are contested? So there are rules in the Arctic, for example, the Svalbard Treaty, which was adopted in 1920, which celebrates its 100 years anniversary. Rules are contested, and UK and Norway shares different treaty interpretation of the Svalbard Treaty. And finally, this is also very important in the Arctic, is when we are talking about the challenges to the rules-based international order, we shouldn't forget there are rules that is being developed or is actually going to be developed. Like, for example, Ambassador Shirashi mentioned the CAO agreement, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. That is new rules. So when you are invited on the table, no matter who you are, which kind of value you hold, you are actually an equal partner to develop the rules. So I think when we are talking about this common narrative of rules-based international order, we really need to be careful and trying to go deeper. And then here comes my final part of the talk today. That is, when we are talking about trying to defend rules-based order rule-based international order in the Arctic, we should bear in mind some legal dilemmas that UK and Japan, I'm talking about UK mostly, that might encounter. One, there are two examples. The first one, as I briefly mentioned, the Svalbard Treaty. The Svalbard Treaty granted Norway full and absolute sovereignty of the archipelago of Svalbard. At the same time, it was adopted in 1920, which means that's long before the entry into force of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, when the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf don't exist. So now here, the Norwegian interpretation of the Svalbard Treaty is it ends at the territorial waters of the archipelago. Well, for UK, it is very clear that that treaty also applies to the maritime zones around Svalbard. And the UK Foreign Affairs even organized a conference in London in 2006, inviting all countries but not Japan. Actually, they invited Japan, but not Norway, to coordinate its position. So here comes the dilemma. If we are thinking if we are thinking the challenges, well, China and Russia actually carries similar positions to UK rather than Norway. Another example is the Northern Sea Route or Northeast Passage. Once again, this is also where there are two dimensions. Russia interpretation of Northeast Passage or Northern Sea Route is internal waters, where both the United States and the European Union are very clear that this is straight for international navigation. China hasn't expressed its position clearly, but it tends to be very, very similar to the American and European view as a shipping state. So possibly do Japan and UK. So you see, when it comes to more details, actually there are lots of specific examples that we need to really take a deep look. So to wrap up my talk, I think maybe what we should do in order to enhance or to make sure that the Arctic is a zone of peaceful cooperation is actually we need to always emphasize that the Arctic is under the stewardship of Arctic people. That means the Arctic Council, which is the most important regional cooperation forum, should be respected and supported and even enhanced by both the Arctic states and non-Arctic states. I think in that sense, we can possibly make sure that a more sustainable and peaceful Arctic. So I will just end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've just been prompted to remind the audience that the poll is ready to be published, so please could you check your screens for the results. And while that is happening, just in response, of course, the Russians have a very specific interpretation of the Svalbard Treaty, and so that you're quite right to point us to these different interpretations. And very intriguingly, of course, when Russia takes over the chair of the Arctic Council, we can expect, I think, to see some developments. But let's remind the audience, perhaps they need no reminding, that the Arctic Council, of course, does not deal with hard security issues and is prohibited from doing so. So that, in a sense, means it's a very specific forum and talks to our idea about cooperation and conflict. But let me go to the chat, please. We have one question from a colleague about the role of China and China as disruptive in terms of a rules-based order. So perhaps all three speakers, but start with Ambassador, the role of China perhaps in the emerging Arctic, please.
Thank you, Caroline. That I agree with that the visibility or presence of China has been increasing a lot. But we have to carefully watch the activity of China in the Arctic. China invests a lot of capital in the natural resource development, and China military ships sailed in the Arctic, but they sailed in just only in high seas. So they are very much careful not that working that international law, not violating international law. So it is difficult for us to say that China so violent that international law. So we have to only in the Arctic. I'm sorry. So we will continue to warn and to China to obey the international law and to respect the maritime that international law. So this is important for China to be more visible in violating some that international law, or more visible to give the threat to Arctic countries and non-Arctic countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aki. Can I ask for your comments?
Yes. As regards to the Arctic and rule-based order, I think China has been a responsible partner, but for China watchers in Japan, what has been a concern is China's efforts to lead the discourse in international arena, which is defined as institutional discourse power. So that has been a very tricky one to, in a way, interpret, because for traditional powers, including Japan, it's very difficult to put finger on. So sure is, as been asked in the Q&A, is the near-Arctic vision to the region and China's near-Arctic vision, is it imposing and causing a lot of stir? It is not, in legally speaking, in legal terms, but it is definitely causing a stir in terms of kind of the discourse, the space of discourse, and the influence it can exert to policymakers in Japan as well.
So, Aki, just to come back, there's been a follow-up in the chat, comparing the UK and Japan's rule-based approach and respect for the Arctic, non-Arctic divide, but comparing that negatively, if you like, to Chinese behavior and respect of that Arctic, non-Arctic.
I think when this, my understanding is that when this phrase rule-based order was first introduced, it kind of was a kind of hidden cue to refer to the elephant in the room, to say we're going to be different from China. But as it emerged, China was actually quite responsible actor, it turned out to be. So that's the difficulty. Sorry, I'm not. I haven't been able to explain it so explicitly. So that is a very difficult part of dealing with China. Let's say in comparison to Russia, because Russia is easy for the West or liberal democracies to point fingers that it's up to no good. But with China, I think their behavior can be very different depending on the region that they're working on. For example, their behavior in South China Sea and behavior regarding the Arctic region are very, very different. So it's very difficult for, I think, countries like Japan to, in a way, project or comprehend how to, in a way, interpret and understand China's behavior.
And thank you, Dr. Liu. If we could turn to you for your comments on that question.
Yeah, and this question certainly has been discussed a lot all over the place. That China, what China does in the South China Sea, and then what China would do or has done in the Arctic. And I think for me, first, I would say to understand China's behavior, we need to understand China's interest. And there are core interests for China. South China Sea is certainly one of the core interests for China. So that's really determines how China behaves in the South China Sea. And when it comes to the Arctic and Antarctica, that's clearly not China's core interest, and it's more like a zone of I would say it's kind of a different zone of interest that China can be relatively collaborative. So that's from a kind of a political perspective. From international legal perspective, what I could see at the moment is China is gradually becoming what I call a interpretive power. So, but this has always been there in international law, that different countries. So there is existing treaties and conventions. Then different countries have different positions regarding the treaty interpretation when it comes to their national interest. So there is always like position A, position B, and then you reach a consensus on position C. But because of China's rising status, and so as what we can observe now in the Arctic and also Antarctica is the same kind of a narrative. That is, this interpretive power become more visible. That China is more confident to express its views towards its views on the interpretations of certain provisions of the treaties and conventions that will suit its interest. So that's kind of where the fear comes in from other part of the world, like this is kind of unprecedented to a large extent in the Western history. So yeah, I think.
I suppose if I could jump in there and link this to another feature of the conversation in the chat, of course, human rights of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic are a major issue for the Arctic Council. But could I just explore here? There's very little doubt that the UK and Japan have established themselves or their claims to be leaders in looking after the rights of indigenous people, but we would have to say very plainly that this has not been the case with China necessarily in terms of a global human rights regime. And so surely there must be a conflict which will become extremely visible on things, let's be clear, on workers' rights and human rights in this vast space. So if I can perhaps go in reverse order for comments on that, because human rights is something that has preoccupied both the UK and Japan in terms of the future of the Arctic.
Yeah, let's just quickly follow up, Carolyn. I think that's a really valuable point, but it's very kind of how to describe. So I think legally speaking, my understanding is both Russia and Japan, both Russia and China, they don't really recognize indigenous people in their domestic legislation. So there is no indigenous people in domestic legislation in Russia and China. So, but at the same time, if you read China's Arctic policy published in 2018, they did commit to respect the indigenous rights in the Arctic. So I'm not trying to defend that what you said, but I think we need to be very specific on those specific kind of issues. That's kind of where I am.
Sorry, Aki.
Yes. With regards to indigenous people's rights, it's one of those things that the Japanese scientists very much kind of learned as they participate in precisely forums like Arctic Council or Arctic Circle, which normally takes place in Iceland, and various kind of international conferences to do with the Arctic. And then I actually explained this in my book, but the Japanese Arctic policy is, well, polar policy is very much driven by the Antarctic policy, where obviously there are no people other than in bases. So we didn't have to pay too much attention to human rights in the same way as in the Arctic. So it's very much been the learning process. But as explained in Japan's Arctic policy, which was released in 2015, as Ambassador Shiraishi mentioned, it very very much clearly mentions the importance of indigenous people's rights. But Japan also has its own baggage to do with indigenous people, who are Ainu, who live in Hokkaido, and it is very, very sensitive and delicate issue still in Japan. My personal hope is that somehow in the future, Japan can also collaborate with Arctic states with Japan's indigenous people's rights, but it may be in a distant future.
Thank you. Ambassador, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Caroline. Talking about the indigenous people, as Aki told, that Japan's Arctic policy very much focuses on on indigenous people. And I would like to introduce that the Japanese researchers has conducted for long years that indigenous people, in order to maintain the indigenous people's human rights and tradition. And also, I am very much aware that indigenous people in the Arctic region and Ainu people, such as just Aki referred to, have already a good exchange of views and the exchange of people, and they have that annually some that gathering each other. So I think that this is that kind of that direction we should continue to protect indigenous people both in the Arctic and in Japan. Thank you.
So there's a lot going on in the chat by distinguished commentators on this, talking about states' rights. But of course, the Russians have themselves really given a version of sovereignty in the Arctic, which is based on sovereign rights as opposed to sovereignty, which of course allows a state like Russia to speak for Russian-speaking peoples across the Arctic. So I think to come back to Dr. Liu's point, we have contesting visions of the states' rights, sovereignty in the Arctic. But Ambassador, while I have you, there's a very specific question in the chat for you, which raises a very interesting question going forward of how Japan, in your presentation, you stressed Japanese economic ambitions in the Arctic, oil, gas, but also this idea of sustainability. And one of our audience would like to know how that can be balanced, how, if you like, not the gold rush, but the oil rush or the gas rush can be balanced against what we hope to see as the protectionism of the Arctic Ocean, even in an era of climate change.
Thank you very much for that good question. And Caroline, that I would like to refer to Aki's words that this investment in the Arctic 2 project, the shareholders is just only 10%. And we are carefully, very much carefully, that paying attention to not that violate that or to give that the negative effects in developing the natural resources in this project. And also, I would like to emphasize one our intention involving that Yamal project. No Japanese company has invested in that Yamal project, but Japanese company provided equipment and machines to Yamal project. We are very much sure that our quality of equipment, equipment made by Japanese company is very high, and to prevent more pollution or some negative effects in Yamal project. We can contribute in that way to maintain, to balance that development and environment. That is my answer.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And of course, what you've just raised there is a very important feature of contemporary Arctic politics, which is the seemingly closeness between Russia and China, and indeed what over the next 5 or 10 years that might mean for the rules-based order. So I wonder if you could give us your view of if you like, the growing and seemingly successful cooperation between Russia and China in terms of the exploitation of the Arctic, even regardless of what we know as the looming problems on the North. So I don't know, Ambassador, if you'd like to answer that, or Aki or Dr. Liu, what Russian-Chinese cooperation / competition might mean in terms of the future order in the Arctic.
Well, I think Japan's understanding of China's interest in the Arctic is that, well, generally speaking, China's external relation is quite defensive in a sense. So for those outside of China, it looks like it's very offensive, but it's very much it's thinking of its own domestic security. But in that regard, China managed to win Russia. So we lost Russia to China. And US, so China's kind of philosophy of sea power is very much kind of inspired by the US Admiral Mahan's sort of like the emphasis of the role of merchant marine. And, but it's impossible for completely decouple for Japan from China, which is also shared view among, I think, all Indo-Pacific countries. So it means that the situation, we lost Russia, I think. Russia is on China's side, but we cannot be decoupling from China completely. So how do we dance within this strategic environment in Asia and the projection of that complexity into the Arctic? So it's very difficult.
I'm sure, Dr. Liu, do you have an answer for us?
Yeah, so let me just follow up what that sustainability question you asked Ambassador Shirashi. And so if we read the EU's Arctic policy, especially the latest one, the 2016 version of the the European Union's Arctic policy, it actually ends up at 2 pillars. The first is sustainable development, and second is addressing climate change. So these are the 2 pillars that the EU would like to justify itself to get involved in the Arctic affairs. And that is pretty much the case in China's Arctic policy as well. So they are also trying to use these 2 kind of pillars to justify why a non-Arctic state should be involved in the Arctic affairs. But my critique of China's Arctic policy, which I spoke to the whole Chinese polar law and policy community in September, is you cannot just think of yourself when you are trying to use these 2 kind of excuses as kind of 2 gateways to get involved in Arctic affairs. As responsible global powers, what China should do in its next Arctic policy, which I'm calling for at the moment, is actually to elaborate. Because this is also what the Arctic is needed. And I think for the EU's next Arctic policy, or the UK's next Arctic policy, should also consider the same thing. So how exactly can we offer a very clear plan for the Arctic, that when those non-Arctic states trying to get involved, they are actually coming to offer a solution, rather than just using those terms, those beautiful terms. Yeah, the climate change, there is a sustainable, we are here to help. But rather than using those beautiful terms to justify its status, So I think that's what I would like to see in the future Arctic policies of non-Arctic states in particular, and especially China. That's what I'm calling for at the moment. So that actually partly answered the second question that Caroline, you pointed out, and which is also a very common kind of a narrative that Russia-China alliance will just overturn whatever we have at the moment, or the existing rules-based order, as we call it. I think for that question, we shouldn't forget Russia is, and that's actually what I realized when I was in the UK, that when we talk about Arctic policy, people tend to forget that Russia is one of the most important Arctic states. It has the longest coastline in the Arctic, and Northern Sea route is treated by Russia as its internal waters. So here comes, some subtle kind of facts kind of under the water, under those common narrative. That is, all right, Russia is very much interested in promoting the use of the Northern Sea route for the Arctic development. But and China is also interested in using the Northern Sea route to connect the Chinese market and European market. But China, not the official Chinese government position, but if you read the Chinese literature published by Chinese academics, it is very clear, because I did this literature review over all the Chinese publications on the Arctic policy, law and policy over the past 10 years. More than 300 papers, and nearly 30% of those papers, surprisingly, I mean, to my surprise, were discussing the legal status of Northeast Passage, or let's say Arctic shipping routes. So you can imagine, that's actually something under the water. So politically, or even geopolitically, Russia and China are very close. That's true. That's very true. But when it comes to specific Arctic futures, I'm not too sure to what extent this would play out. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to let you know that on the poll, it's 50-50. 50% of the audience think cooperation will be the hallmark, and the other 50% think it's going to be conflict. So we're divided. But to follow on Dr. Liu, a colleague from Cambridge has joined us and would like, and this is connected, and perhaps I'll go back to the ambassador for her thoughts. This question is about a view on the evolving Sino-Russian sea power as a result of LNG deliveries along the Northern Sea route to Western Pacific destinations. Could this challenge US sea power in that region? Ambassador, over to you.
Using that Northern Sea route, I mean that sailing the Arctic Ocean via Northern Sea route, as I told you, that the number of ships has been increasing in recent 2 years, but frankly speaking, just only one LNG vessel called at Japanese port in Tokyo during 2 years. What does it mean? Still, that still Japanese sailing maritime company is not so enthusiastic to use this Northern Sea route. Still, they are facing some difficulties. They are the very big marine ship company called Mitsui Line Company has continued to has cooperation in Russian authority to avoid any conflict with Russian court authority during the sailing Northern Sea route. Still, that process is still continuing. Then I don't know how develop that cooperation between this Japanese marine line company and Russian authorities going on. How does it mean? What does it mean that cooperation between Russian authority and Japanese maritime company is necessary? That means there is many aspects unclear, that there are many aspects of the limitation from the Russian authority. So that is the main reason. Still, Japanese company are not enthusiastic in using this Northern Sea route. But if that the severe problem or possible problems for sailing the Arctic Ocean via Northern Sea route will be solved, I hope that there is a more potential, more possibility to use for Japan to use this Northern Sea route. And I don't think that this commercial sailing is not some that threat to any American or some other Arctic states threat. That this is just only for the commercial and the business purpose.
Okay, can I go to Aki then, please?
I'm actually kind of trying to sort of connect day-to-day working in the scientific community with regards to the Arctic, and then much more kind of a conceptual interest of the audience. And as Ambassador Shiraishi mentioned, for those working on the Arctic in Japan, or from Japan, it's not about the kind of power relations that seem to bother them much. Is actually much more kind of a more mundane practical things, like a Russian authority taking very long time to allow Japanese vessels to go through Northern Sea route, as Ambassador mentioned, or for example, data openness of the data. It's very difficult for example, for Arctic researchers to predict weather patterns and such, because some of the data only comes from where Russia has the control of the data. And even if we wanted to get data, it takes ages to get a permission from Russian authority and then conduct scientific research. So I'm not sure how that can relate to the much more grand power relations related to LNG transport. But when we talk about rule-based order, it should be actually solving minute and mundane and sometimes boring inconveniences to make scientific research open and possible, including countries like Russia and China, where that's not necessarily the norm. If I don't know if that answered the questions.
No, thank you, Aki. And I'm afraid, Ambassador, I'm making you work very hard, but your talk has engendered much traffic. And there's a very specific question here, which is, does Japan have any specific cultural programs in terms of the Arctic indigenous people? Perhaps, Aki, you also know this, which will enable the rich diversity of cultures and languages to survive. Even as we know, many parts of the Arctic are hollowing out, younger people are leaving, women in particular are leaving. Is Japan taking much of a leadership role, is the question, in promoting the retention of culture and languages?
Yes, through, if Ambassador, would you like to respond? Oh, okay. I'm part of the ARCS, which is a national flagship project on the Arctic amongst Japanese, mostly scientists based in Japan. And we, from this year, also previously from when the ARCS began in 2015, if I remember, we have a small group of social and humanities and social scientists, which is unprecedented for Japanese polar research, which is probably different from the UK. And there are scholars who know and who are very knowledgeable and expert about indigenous peoples, especially in Russia. but I'm not sure if that has connected to necessarily to Japanese sort of original efforts in preserving native languages in indigenous communities in Japan. In indigenous peoples in Japan.
Thank you, Aki. Dr. Liu, you were waving at me. Would you like to jump in before the ambassador?
Yes, just quickly, I'm reading page 18 of the Scottish Arctic policy, and it devotes the whole page to promoting and protecting indigenous languages. So UK does have Scotland does have a very, very clear initiative to promote indigenous languages. But of course here it mentions mostly about promoting Scottish, Scots and Gaelic languages. And also only one paragraph here saying the richness of cultural significance of the Inuit and Sami languages was celebrated by the Throwing Voices event held during the 2019 Edinburgh International Book Festival. So just to provide some information.
Well, Dr. Liu, thank you for throwing in this early in the morning in the UK and our Brexit trauma, the assertion of Scottish Arctic policy as opposed to British Arctic policy. But could I just, I'm afraid we're coming to an end now. Could I thank all of our panelists, Your Excellency Aki, Dr. Liu, for a fascinating talk. And I think, Dr. Liu, you've pointed us to the fact we do need a session on Scottish Arctic policy, to which you return enthusiastically, shall we say. Just to remind everyone that the poll was split 50-50 between those of us who believe that the Arctic future will be one of cooperation, others who believe it will be something more conflict-ridden, and perhaps really to take the middle ground, it will be a mix of both, depending on how we organise ourselves. So if I could thank everyone for taking part, thank Chatham House for hosting, and thank the audience, and hand over to Chatham House to end the session. Thank you.